The overall estimate for the globe is on the order of 21 to 32 trillion as of year-end 2010, and that leaves out non-financial assets like housing. Much of the city of London is owned by offshore companies. Stock, sort of yacht collections and art collections and so forth are also a favorite topic for offshore companies, but this is just financial wealth. If we were able to tax that, we'd be able to pay for all of our development costs every year. And so one proposal TJN has is to levy a 1% tax on anonymous capital that's parked offshore in banks. This is the total, but let's go to the banks. We took a look, a second way of addressing this measurement issue was to take a look individually at the top 50 banks involved in international private banking and how much assets under management, deposits, and cross-border brokerage fees, brokerage assets they have. And that added up, just for those top 50 institutions, to $12.1 trillion as of the end of 2010. Top 10 of which accounted for about half the total. And those are the same players that we've become familiar with in the last decade from the financial crisis. UBS, Credit Suisse, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, Deutsche Bank, BNP Paribas, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, HSBC. These were also among the biggest lenders during the 1980s to developing countries. And we saw so much odious debt grow up. And they're also the big players in the LIBOR scandal. They all got bailed out in the financial crisis. And here, they're engaged in helping the wealthiest folks in the world move that 21 trillion offshore. By the way, that 21 trillion is owned by about 0.1% of the world's population, less than 10 million people. And the top 100,000 families own about a third of it. So it really distorts our statistics of, if we ignore this phenomenon, all of our measures of income and wealth inequality are vastly too low. But that indicates the practicability of slapping a 1% tax on these 50 banks and the assets that they have, using that money for development or climate change. Let me just go through the statistics on Africa. One of the methods we've used is to look at unrecorded capital flight from Africa and then to look at the stocks of offshore wealth that have been accumulated beyond the reach of tax authorities in these source regions. The so-called sources and uses method, which is pretty standard practice since the 1980s, but we've changed it to adapt to the fact that there's a lot of wealth retention offshore. People don't just consume the money once it's offshore, it's also reinvested. So in the case of Latin America, the flows added up to more than 1.5 trillion, and the next slide, please. And the total stocks from all of Latin America are worth about $2 trillion. That compares with Latin American debt outstanding of about $1 trillion. A major finding there is that once the capital flows outside, the earnings that continue to be earned by it are not repatriated, amounts to a new source of capital flight, even though the fresh flows from, say, Argentina and Brazil have dried up. You can see this unrecorded and unreported earnings continue to grow and even get large enough to dominate the new flows. So the offshore assets continue to grow even though fresh capital flight has dried up. And that's an important lesson for those of us who are concerned about capital flight from Africa. Think about, even though we've stopped the existing flows, we still have countries like Nigeria where the outflows effectively are continuing because of all the unreported reinvested earnings offshore. So for Sub-Saharan Africa, The numbers are small compared to Latin America, but they're still substantial compared with the size of these countries' economies. Here we have about a total flight stock as of year-end 2010 of $645 billion. And that compares with total external debt for those countries of $117 billion. So again, Africa, like Latin America, is a net creditor of the OECD countries, because all of this capital is being invested offshore, most of it in Western financial markets, by way of the haven industry. The biggest players here, you can go back, sorry. Biggest players here in terms of absolute size, Nigeria, of course, South Africa are the largest players. For the developing world as a whole, the numbers are the following. As of the end of 2010, they had gross external debt on the order of $4 trillion. They had, on the other hand, net reserves of about $6.5 trillion. And then you add in this private capital on the order of $7 to $9 trillion. So the developing world as a whole is a net creditor of wealthy countries to the tune of about $11 trillion, which is about 3.5 times what they ever borrowed from Western countries in the height of the debt crisis. Keep going. Yep. We've done this for every region in the world, 139 countries. But if anyone wants a copy of the presentation, I won't bore you with the details here for all of these regions. The basic fact is that we have another pathology on an enormous scale, which is the growth of this offshore industry and all the missing wealth that's associated with it means that all of the countries involved have had a problem once they've opened up. And so, keep going. Here we go. This is for Latin America, focusing on capital outflows versus net foreign investment. And this also applies to every single country in Africa. The outflows basically swamp the net foreign investment inflows relative to GDP. So one of the benefits of openness and opening the capital account is to have access to foreign direct investment. We know that. It brings technology as well as raw dollars, raw euros. But the penalty has been, given the overall effect of openness, that you've made it much easier for folks to take money out of the country. And unless you have some way of taxing it and getting a claim on it, if you're just dependent on the traditional system of having countries dependent, countries responsible for taxation on their own, if the countries are not collaborating with each other, if they're competing with each other on taxes, then you have this black hole continuing to grow, because there's a tax wedge for people who have the opportunity and the means to do so, to use the private banking industry to take the money out at the same time that foreign direct investment is coming in. Keep going. More numbers than you can possibly stand. Let's move on to the next slide, because I want to conclude here quickly. Keep going. This is an important one. Globally speaking, I talked about the top 10 million, so there's about, this slide makes that more dramatic, with happy few people with average wealth of greater than 30 million, which is about 90, now it is about 100,000. We have to add in the 100 Chinese billionaires that were reported in the last 3 weeks, including some members of the Politburo. They have offshore assets on the order of $10 trillion and total liquid net worth on the order of $17 trillion. So I think it was Brecht who said, it is it is really capitalism that is radical. This is a radical world that we're living in, with 100,000 people owning a third of financial wealth. The impact on developing countries, in Africa in particular, has to do with the tax system, because if capital has feet and is very mobile and has an open door, and there's this huge industry offshore to help wealthy people evade taxes or move their money, and they're also working for all kinds of other shady characters, then it becomes possible for the rich to evade taxes, and the tax burden for essential services like government and public safety and health and education falls on the poor. And so we do see this pattern of low-income countries having to rely on sales taxes, on VAT taxes. It's practically a program for the IMF to go in and implement a VAT tax on the argument that they can't possibly tax this fleet-footed capital. But that's the kind of tax system you end up with. Let's take an example of Brazil. Brazil, a relatively developed country, but the top 10% of Brazilians pay a lower share of the cost of government in Brazil than the bottom half of the population, because they rely heavily on VAT taxes and sales taxes and excise taxes, and they end up with a tax system that's completely regressive. And that's the problem that all of these countries face if they're going to be tax competing with each other. Let's go for 1 second to Zambia, if I can find an example. Keep going, yeah. Well, there's a lot of studies that have been done recently of transfer pricing. I won't try to go through them all now, but I just wanted to highlight this one case because it's glaring. Zambia is a big copper exporter. They export, however, all of their copper through a Swiss company called Glencore, and also a Chinese company. One of Glencore's partners is First Quantum, which is listed on the Toronto Exchange, a well-known Vancouver company. But if you look at the Swiss foreign accounts, they don't show any copper coming into Switzerland. When Zambia shows all of its copper basically going into Switzerland. So what accounts for the discrepancy? Well, we have this phenomenon here called export over-invoicing. It's just the opposite of conventional invoicing. Usually you expect the exports to be underreported in order to conserve on the taxes. So what we find here is a very unusual case, but it turns out not to be unusual, because when you look at havens like Switzerland and their transactions with the rest of the world, you find lots of countries that are engaged in export over-invoicing to Switzerland. Russia, Mexico, lots of resource producers in Africa that are essentially finding that their exports, their commodity exports, are being booked elsewhere for tax purposes. And so all of Glencore's copper is being booked in places like BVI. Profits are parked there. They don't get back to Zambia. If Zambia got the same price for its copper that Glencore does, the Zambian GDP would increase by 50%. So this is a big issue for these countries, and they need to understand the salient importance of multinational behavior with respect to transfer pricing. From the OECD standpoint, the OECD is the richest 34 countries, including the United States and most of the European countries, Canada is a member, have something called the so-called arm's length transfer pricing standard. This is fancy language, but we have to understand it because it's really critical for developing countries to get this, to understand. Arm's length requires you to assume that there are competitive markets for all of these commodities, and you can find objective reference prices to see whether the prices that the companies are using when they transfer within themselves are right. So 70% of international trade is going within companies. It isn't subject to competitive markets. And